Boys, oh boys. My goodness, my Guinness. Man alive. Inane expressions that I say, not when I am thinking of him, but precisely the opposite, when I am not thinking of him, or in fact, when I imagine I haven't thought about him in years even. Brother Kevin embodied a quarrelsome mixture of both the parochial and the global, although he would have smiled at the overblown use of this last term. He was as knowledgeable about matters of the tribe, such as the hopes and dreams of inter-county football, as he was about a bloodletting vendetta in a short story by Maupassant. Fluent in French from his years in Canada, he nevertheless spoke English with the raspy quality of a Monaghan man like Patrick Kavanagh. Though true to his vow of celibacy, he was a lover after a fashion. He was passionate about strong coffee, old-fashioned parlour songs, and the kind of poems that rhymed and spoke about the beauty of the world which could be found in old cloth-bound books. He was betimes amused or annoyed by our youthful arrogance, but his undemonstrative liking for us usually overcame his occasional impatience with the shortcomings in our adolescent manners. To the dispassionate observer, Brother Kevin appeared to be a portly man of purplish hue, heading ungainly for the golden groves of retirement. He had the menial task of teaching us Latin and French, in addition to history. He took much delight in the telling of quirky stories, so much so that it was easy to deflect his attention, and our own, away from Caesar's rather monochrome account of the Gallic Wars, or the limply perfect family Dupont of our tattered French textbooks. So it was that, quite often, minutes after the bell had gone, signalling the end of class, Brother Edgar the Superior would appear impatiently in the doorway of the classroom and rap his knuckles ever so precisely on the glass. At such moments, Brother Kevin would be bidden to step out of his anecdotage and allow the sanctity of the school timetable to prevail. Most of us that time were indifferent to the many indignities that Brother Kevin suffered at the hands of efficiency and good order, but I was an exception. Like Brother Kevin in his contrariness, I too was a bit of an outsider. And outsiders tend to understand other outsiders. It was this quality of not quite fitting in that ensured a mutual recognition between us from the first day we encountered each other in the classroom. I had entered the rather medieval boarding school for boys in third year, so unlike my classmates, I was a new student. By then, Brother Kevin and the other boys had already long established their positions in the type of trench warfare that passes for classroom interaction in many secondary schools. We were doing some Latin vocabulary work, and always eager to tantalize sleeping minds with a question to provoke a glimmer of intellectual curiosity, Brother Kevin read out the Latin word crass, meaning, as every schoolboy should have known at the time, tomorrow. The question he posed was, could anybody tell him what word in modern English had crass as its root? He looked around the silent classroom, seeming to savour our level of ignorance, the wisp of a grin emerging cat-like at the corners of his mouth. And of course, just like that, the word popped into my head and I called out, procrastination. At once, Brother Kevin's densely haired eyebrows bounced, and he collected himself up out of his chair, notwithstanding an arthritic hip, and reached forward to shake my hand. What he didn't know then was that this was a bit of a fluke on my part. I would in fact turn out to be an indifferent Latin scholar, who would have to be granted safe passage through all subsequent classes on the basis of that one glorious moment of cultural sophistication. He would be openly aggrieved at a sloppy translation by any of the other boys who hadn't acquired the same cultural capital as I had on that first day. I was spared the unholy mutterings under his breath when the insult of one bad translation was added to by another, and then another. His bad temper then would often result in a kind of bull-baiting by some of the class. One of these, McKeever, would produce some nonsense sound like bing or oing. Using a curious ventriloquist ability, he would bounce the sound to an unsuspecting boy who would by now be on the edge of sleep. Brother Kevin would rise up inflamed then and confront this boy with his unreasonable behaviour, and the boy would not unreasonably plead innocence. The culprit McKeever would grin, leer in fact, at a perplexed Brother Kevin, who would then round on him and demand what this was all about. McKeever would never respond, but would maintain the leer, and Brother Kevin, sensing that he was once again outfoxed, would end the matter by proclaiming, "McKeever, there is something very unnatural about you." This provoking loud guffaws from the rest of us. One sleepy Tuesday afternoon in a history lesson, for Brother Kevin was actually following the timetable, attempting to teach history instead of mistakenly teaching one of the other subjects, as he often did, the subject of the Book of Kells came up. It turned out that he had just heard that a new reproduction of the book had been published, with lavish colour photographs. Meeting our teenage indifference, he exhorted us to be proud of this symbol of our Celtic and Christian heritage. A few days later, still afloat with the news of the new edition of the Book of Kells, Brother Kevin suggested to us that the school should purchase the book. He talked hopefully about displaying it in a strategic location somewhere in the school. It would be housed in a varnished wooden case with a glass front, where it could be read by all. Students could take turns, turning a page each day, so that there would always be something new to see. Taking our bemused silence for approval, Brother Kevin completely lost himself in the supposed educational and spiritual benefits that would accrue to us because of the very presence of this book. He decided there and then that he would make the wooden case himself in the college woodwork room. The case, with its hallowed contents, would be mounted on the wall at the bottom of the main staircase on the way to the study hall. Every student would see it as they walked by and could stop and appreciate the glory that was Celtic Ireland. The reproduction copy of the Book of Kells would inspire us to excellence and remind us all of what we were capable of, if we put our minds to it. Brother Edgar, probably being as much a Philistine as the majority of the students, appeared none too convinced by Brother Kevin's book proposal. The thought of actually spending money on students was foreign to him. Besides, it must have seemed a needless expense, given the shabby condition due to the lack of funds of the front parlour, reserved as it was for visiting dignitaries. It looked as though Brother Edgar would reject the Book of Kells plan outright. In those days of doubt, Brother Kevin began to noticeably wilt, and his lessons became increasingly leaden. Was it out of pity for him or ourselves that we organised a petition in favour of Brother Kevin's scheme? Much of the footwork was done by a small group of fifth-years like myself, and in a couple of days we had cajoled, persuaded, and browbeaten every student to sign. We even got the visiting chaplain, Father Godfrey, to lend weight to the list of signatories. On our urging, he graciously handed the completed petition to Brother Edgar over breakfast after Mass one morning. This one big signature swung it. Brother Edgar not wanting to appear lacklustre with regard to spiritual matters before another man of the cloth. In the following days, Brother Kevin seemed to float into classes, and for a couple of weeks miraculously made the family Dupont seem a hip-witted, okay bunch of people. His good humour carried over into the woodwork room, where he spent his spare hours assembling the wooden case for the hallowed Book of Kells, while abstractedly whistling one of Tom Moore's melodies. And then came the day of the unveiling ceremony. Performed with a routine 15-minute break from classes, Brother Edgar not wanting to make too big a deal of it. There was the chest-proud speechifying of Brother Kevin, counterpointed by the matter-of-fact earnestness of Brother Edgar, who all the while showed an unusually keen interest in the movement of his platinum Rolex. We had about a month, then, when Brother Kevin rose above the agonies of his arthritis and the worrying suspicion that in the biblical sense he was throwing pearls before swine. My special treatment in class was causing some resentment, and I needed to gain some street cred among my peers. So it was that, having been goaded into the prohibited act of sliding down the banisters of the senior staircase while backs were momentarily turned, I lost my balance and collided with over 1,000 years of Celtic Christian civilization, namely the Book of Kells, in its now shattered viewing box. The whole thing was dislodged from its place on the wall. The glass cover was no more, and I was showered in glass. One elderly brother, arriving unsuspectingly on the scene, pranced in dismay, crying out, "What boy is responsible?" To which I wanted to rather pedantically reply, "You mean, what boy is irresponsible?" But this was no time for pedantry. I immediately made myself very scarce and spent a long time in the toilets picking shards of glass out of my hair with bloodied fingers. Brother Kevin almost didn't show up to class the next day, and when he did, there was a long, thunderous silence marked by the glare of a pair of searchlight eyes. I should have owned up, of course, but I feared losing his approval in a place where words of encouragement were as foreign as Russian or Chinese. Of course, I was never even under suspicion. McKeever, however, couldn't resist his usual leering at Brother Kevin, even when the rest of us had the good sense to look away. This provoked Brother Kevin to ask him directly if he had been involved in the desecration of the great book. Being McKeever, he automatically denied any knowledge or involvement, as if schooled by a clever defence lawyer. Given his reputation for mischief, this convinced Brother Kevin of his guilt, and he marched him off to an infuriated Brother Edgar, who didn't give him a second chance to explain. The book itself was not actually damaged, and in fact the wooden case was largely intact, except for the broken glass of the lid. I came to understand then that what had really shattered was Brother Kevin's belief in us, despite our worst moments. And although I was never under suspicion, it seemed as if the man regarded me more coolly than before. I was probably viewed as one of those who at the very least must have known. Surprisingly, McKeever was never actually punished. Brother Senan, for some reason, wouldn't allow it, and this had the effect of us all feeling vaguely guilty about our involvement. And so we combined our efforts to assemble the case for the book again and to return it to its prominent position at the bottom of the senior staircase. Surprisingly for us, this did not seem to appease Brother Kevin, who no longer showed any further interest in the book. The practice of turning the pages daily soon was forgotten, and the key for the wooden case eventually went missing. Exams began to loom, and our minds, for a brief spell, focused on what we actually needed to learn to pass those exams. Brother Kevin's storytelling in class soon evaporated. For a few years after that, I would occasionally bump into Brother Kevin in the street, sporting bicycle clips long after they'd gone out of fashion. He would inquire politely about how I was getting on in college and the like, and I would entertain the possibility of telling him about that day when I crashed into his beloved Book of Kells. But I could never actually manage to tell him the truth. After all, I was now one of his success stories, studying honours French up at the college. I wanted him to continue to regard me as the lad who ferreted procrastination from Crass in his Latin lesson one day and renewed his faith in the art of teaching. That I was also responsible for shaking that faith was a truth neither of us would have wanted to confront.